Good afternoon. I'm grateful to speak to you today from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And I'm here as the Minister of Education to provide an update on back-to-school plans for K-12 families. With me is my Deputy Minister, Scott MacDonald. Today, our ministry and schools across BC are taking the best science-based public health advice and planning to have as many children as possible back in classrooms in September. We know that schools are at the heart of our neighborhoods and communities, and they're the best places for students to learn and develop their abilities, knowledge, and skills. And for all those reasons, there's no substitute for in-class learning. We know from research here in British Columbia and around the world that there are consequences when children are not in school for extended periods of time. This can impact child development and the individual success of students and kids progressing through school and their life opportunities after school. School is where kids learn with their peers, with teachers and teaching assistants. It's where they grow. And for some children, school is a safe haven they have in their lives. It's the place where they learn and gain confidence in their abilities, the place where they often get fed properly. And in some cases, it's the only quiet space they have to study and to be able to ask questions and get help from caring adults. The closure of school in March and April had a profound, dislocating impact on the lives of many parents, students, and school staff. When British Columbia was in stage 4, the ministry and districts ensured schools were there for the children of essential service workers and vulnerable students, as well as those with complex learning needs. Meal and technology lending programs were developed and delivered by school districts to create supports and a measure of learning continuity at a time of disruption and uncertainty for BC families. In June, 200,000 students returned to the classroom in our province, but 400,000 students did not. And some of those students will have been away from a school setting for almost half a year when they return this September. We've learned a lot as a province over the past several months. The BC Centre for Disease Control and the Ministry of Education surveyed 26,000 parents and caregivers by July. The majority told us that they felt a lot of stress trying to support their children with at-home remote learning while holding down their jobs and trying to adapt to the changes in the school system and the world around them. We've been through a lot, and we've stayed resilient while our province and its public health leadership helped BC tackle the pandemic and keep our people safe better than almost anywhere in the world. And that's why our goal continues to be ensuring most students can safely return to the classroom full-time this year. Today, all 60 public school districts have posted their detailed restart plans online, so parents and families can continue to prepare and support their children for a safe return to the classroom. We've had a chance to review each of these plans, and I'm impressed by the thoughtful, considerate, and innovative local solutions that we see within those plans. There's no question, as we all know, that schools are going to look very different than they did before the pandemic began, or even in June. Much like vital services and businesses that reopened are very different than they were before the pandemic. And education is one of those vital services in our province. It is a must for all children, and it must be delivered in the best and safest way possible. The plans approved and published today confirm that all elementary and middle schools will have access to full-time in-class instruction within the safety measures developed by the Provincial Health Office and the BC Centre for Disease Control. While many secondary schools will be able to support secondary students to return to the classroom full-time, there are many schools with larger populations, from Sooke to Surrey, that will offer a blend of in-class and remote learning. Some districts, from Coquitlam to Cowichan, are staggering pick-up and drop-off times as well as classroom, break, and lunch times. And whether it's in-class or blended learning, any student who requires additional support will always be prioritized for full-time in-class learning. The majority of school districts, almost 70%, are moving towards a quarterly semester system, so students will study 2 courses every 10 weeks. In communities like Chilliwack, Nelson, Sooke, Prince Rupert, and Campbell River, secondary schools will offer 1 course at a time for 5 weeks, so everyone can stay in the classroom with the same teacher for most of the day. That's why I encourage all families to visit their local school district's website to find out the details of their local plans. These plans will help you visualize what your child's school and learning environment will look like this fall, and families should feel more confident knowing that schools are doing everything possible to keep students and staff safe. While there's no substitute for in-class learning, we also know there are families who, for medical, health, or other reasons, don't feel comfortable yet having their children back in class, and that is completely understandable. We understand that parents and caregivers are looking for more options, and this is something we've been discussing in great detail with our stakeholder-led steering committee and education partners for the past several weeks. Based on these discussions and the interests and ideas shared, it is my expectation as the Minister of Education that school districts will be flexible. They will work with families to provide options to keep children connected to their school communities. And that's why I've directed school districts to contact all families in their school communities to share their safety plans and to confirm if their child is attending school or if they require a remote online learning option. Since the plan was announced on July 29th, many districts have already begun engaging with parents to determine their needs. When it comes to options, BC is a diverse province, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Every school district will do what fits best with their local community needs, and we've given them the ability to be flexible and find options that work for families. We've given them the tools they need to increase their existing programs and to identify and meet new demand. We've extended the authority to all school boards to flexibly offer remote learning programs to students within their districts and local bricks and mortar schools. And we provided districts with the ability to expand their local distributed learning programs to include additional grades and services to students and district schools to meet those local needs. Internet access has been upgraded for all schools in the province through the K-12 Next Generation Network. We've provided and will continue to provide a provincial license for Zoom so all students have a secure platform for real-time video conferencing. We have now over 2,000 curated curriculum learning resources available for educators, and we've developed materials and a webinar series hosted by experts to support teachers and those who are serving students remotely. When it comes to supporting students, districts have been provided additional funds through the Safe Return to Schools grant to purchase things and loan technology to students like tablets or laptops that support an educational program. Regardless of what platform education is delivered, in-class learning or remote learning, supporting students with curriculum content and social and emotional well-being resources is our top priority. Given the unpredictability of the pandemic, we know there may be enrollment and in-class participation that varies throughout this school year. And that's why we will continue working with school districts to stay flexible and nimble as students' needs change. And we must provide the same flexibility so they can direct their funding to the appropriate programs and services and redirect those resources when necessary. BC's education system is benefiting from significantly improved funding for our schools, including an additional $546 million in new money in Budget 2020. Public schools in BC will receive a total of $6.24 billion in operating and special grants in 2020-21. That's nearly a 20% increase over what government provided in 2016-17 and is an increase equivalent to $1,900 per public school student in the province. And our government is committed to stable, secure funding to support students, schools, and districts during this health crisis. Support like this will help students maintain their learning and keep them connected to their local school community. Today, the federal government has also announced $2 billion for provinces and territories to support school restart plans throughout Canada. We've been talking with the federal government about the need for more resources and for our provincial restart and schools, and we're very appreciative of the additional support announced today. The funding builds on the work we've already done to support a safe restart of BC schools with $45.6 million in new COVID-specific funding to ensure students and staff are safe. This includes new funding provided provincially for 1.5 million non-medical masks, additional hand washing stations, physical barriers, and cleaning supplies, as well as hiring more custodians, purchasing technology, and supporting students with complex needs. This additional funding will provide districts with the resources to purchase additional PPE if needed, install more plexiglass barriers, purchase cleaning equipment such as foggers, improve ventilation systems, and hire even more custodians to further increase cleaning frequency in school facilities and in transportation services. The additional funding also allows us to provide more resources to districts so they can invest even further in these areas and to continue providing ongoing learning opportunities in a safe way. Let me speak for a moment about Indigenous communities. Supporting Indigenous communities continues to be a priority in every district's back-to-school plans. We know there are some First Nations communities who are not comfortable sending their children back to school full-time given the historic impacts of pandemics on Indigenous communities and the need to protect elders in those communities. And that's why every school district is also working with First Nations to ensure their students are supported. I'm very pleased to see that in the approved plans, communities from Gold River to Vernon are consulting with local First Nations to arrange for teachers to go into the community to provide learning for those students. Parents and caregivers can expect to hear directly from their school district and their local school. They have the opportunity now to go online and look at the local district plans. I think it would be wise to remind folks that those of you who screen calls for phone numbers that you don't recognize, it may be your local school district calling you to personally follow up on the emails you've been receiving. In the meantime, we're continuing to work with our education partners, teachers, parents, Indigenous rights holders, school leaders, elected trustees, and support staff. We remain, as a school system in British Columbia, dynamic, nimble, and flexible so that all students are able to continue their learning and stay connected to their community school for this upcoming year. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. As a reminder to reporters on the phone, please press star 1 to enter the queue. You are limited to one question and one follow-up only. Please also take your phones off mute. You're not audible until I call your name. First question is from Randy Shore, Vancouver Sun.
Hi, I'm wondering what happens if a large number of students don't return in September but attempt to reclaim a classroom spot in October or later.
Yeah. So this is why it's so critically important for school districts to be doing an enhanced registration enrollment outreach, which many districts are doing right now. There are districts like Surrey, Richmond, Vancouver, a number of districts in different regions across British Columbia that are doing exactly that, to determine where students are at, what their family decision-making looks like, to have an opportunity to explain what local school plans look like, and to see what their family situation is like and their intention to return to school, or they're looking for an additional option. What we heard from school districts, and we've had these discussions for a number of weeks, is that they wanted funding flexibility and security to be able to deliver things a little bit differently, understanding that we are in an unprecedented school year. And that's what we're confirming today. So district leaders have appreciated that direction, have worked with us on how it might work, and they're going to have a much more accurate picture of what that demand looks like. It's going to look different in different parts of the province, there's no question about that. And what I have been given some additional comfort in is that the enthusiasm and the confidence in the school system to be able to respond once they're given flexibility to serve all families aligns perfectly with our ministry mandate to make sure that every kid come September is involved in an education program, no matter where they live in the province.
Do you have a follow-up, Randy?
Well, I'm wondering about the September 30 count. Schools will organize their classes. They'll staff up. How much flexibility will they have after that point?
Well, I think what's really crucially important is the orientation week from September 8th to 11th, and the, as I mentioned, the enhanced outreach that's being done personally by school leaders with local families to make them aware of those opportunities, to stay in touch with them as they make their decisions. We are going to remain flexible with our school district partners. We are partners in making sure that all families are supported, and we respect that there are different choices being made by different families based on their circumstances. So, I think it's encouraging to see that a number of districts are beginning to develop and provide options that maybe weren't anticipated a couple of months ago, and that all districts are explaining their plans, which have just been posted today. to give local accurate information and give families the opportunity to see what school will look like in their district and to carry on those conversations to confirm enrollment. So whether it's in a remote program or in class, what I've said today is that the funding is secure. The Ministry of Education, our government, the province of BC, wants to make sure that districts are kept whole and have funding that allows them to be flexible and nimble and provide the responses and education programs that they need to do for their local families.
Kelsey Nichols, Global News.
Hi, Minister. Parents of children with special needs say some school boards don't seem to be offering any kind of remote learning options. Are you making it mandatory that all schools offer more remote learning to returning students, or will they be shuffled around to a district that does?
Well, what I would say to a parent in that situation, not knowing which district you might be referring to, is that they contact their local school now. Also to look at the plans. We have said, and districts have agreed and wholeheartedly embraced, that kids with complex learning needs, with diverse abilities, are a priority in terms of the supports that they get to keep them engaged and be successful in school. We reinforced that both in Stage 4 and Stage 3, where we were last spring. And that was a requirement in the plans that were developed and released on July 29th. The districts go away and plan exactly on those principles, serving families of children with diverse abilities. It will look different in different parts of British Columbia. Again, districts have their own unique programs that exist now. They will adapt them as they see fit to be able to serve families in that regard.
Do you have a follow-up, Kelsey?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Binder Sudjan, CTV.
Hi, Minister. So I'm just wondering, if parents choose this remote option, would they lose their spot in the school? That's something that some are concerned about.
So again, this has been part of our conversation. Districts wanting to support their families, understanding that we're all in this together during a difficult pandemic time, and making sure that they have the right set of options available for families based on their circumstances. And while catchment policies may be solely a school district responsibility under the School Act, we do know that districts are interested in the funding flexibility I've announced to be able to provide flexible and innovative remote learning opportunities to be able to preserve that connection to their local community schools. So that was a point of discussion that was made by school leaders around the province to me, and that's what I'll expect to see in communities right around BC.
Binder, would you like a follow-up?
Yes, and on a slightly different topic, but two BC fathers have filed a lawsuit asking a judge to grant an injunction to keep schools closed. They say that the ministry's current plan is, quote, reckless and has the potential to harm students and their families, and say that's an imminent and substantial threat. I'm just wondering what your response is to that.
Yeah. Well, I don't have one at this time because I'm not aware of the legal application that you've described. If it requires a government response specifically to that claim or that filing, that will be, if it's necessary, that will be forthcoming.
Next question is from Franya Nora, the GOAT.
Hi, thank you, Minister. Minister, in July, you mentioned that the ministry was looking into it was going to do quantitative research to determine the levels of disengagement and sort of the effects of the spring being out of school in this regard. Can you provide an update on what the ministry has learned?
Yeah, so I cited some of that in my remarks. We did an extensive survey of 26,000 parents in the public and independent school system, as well as students. There was a student survey with somewhere between 10 and 15,000 responses. There was also a section in that survey that had open-ended responses, so we could actually look at the individual comments about what people's experiences were, how the pandemic changes to society and schools had impacted their learning and their mental health and well-being, all those sorts of things. We haven't published it yet. It's in draft. It's under review. But the findings there around, the common theme was that stress was heightened for families. Difficulties were experienced supporting children at home. Parents discovered in many cases they weren't teachers. But also we heard that while there was inconsistency, there was also some great reports around teachers really rallying to the situation and providing a good learning continuity. What is most important from that research, though, is really to sort of drive towards excellence around what we learned, how we improve professional development and remote learning expertise. We want to reopen schools safely in stage 2, but none of us has a crystal ball about where the pandemic will go. We have a stages document and a school plan that allows us to move forward or to move backwards depending on the conditions as they may be. And that research and advice I think is very helpful for government and also for the BC Centre for Disease Control, who is our partner in gathering it, to understand what worked and what didn't for families and what the risks and consequences are for an extended period of school closures in BC.
Fran, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. So what's your long-term concern in terms of fallout or consequences of students whose parents maybe decide not to return their kids to school?
Well, we want to support everyone with a good education program, no matter what option is one that they make a decision in favor of for their families. I think we want to encourage those families who don't feel ready to return to school to keep an open mind to gather information about the safe restart to schools. Districts will be making contact with families about their local plans and what their local schools will look like, and that information could include everything from staggered breaks and drop-off times to how the school is configured and hours of operation, all those sorts of things. Or if it's a secondary school, how in many cases the delivery model has changed in terms of a new semesterly model and the public health principles behind keeping those schools safe. So what I would say is that districts in the ministry share the same concern, which is to support kids no matter where they're learning from this year in the best manner possible. And we have confirmed the resources to be able to do that. Many districts are out developing options that families have expressed preliminary interest in, and I think that outreach is really critical to have an accurate assessment of what the demand is like for different options.
Graham Wood, Glacier Media.
Hi there, Rob. What do you say to the people who consider it a double standard for politicians such as you to social distance at your work, but students and teachers are not given the opportunity, particularly when over 20 children can be put in a small portable with few windows? And will you be requiring school boards to meet face-to-face with an opportunity for the public to safely address them?
Well, what I would say is that all guidelines for the reopening of vital services or businesses, or the K-12 setting in particular, have been developed by science and the public health leadership of the Provincial Health Office and the BC Centre for Disease Control. And that is why there are layers of protection in schools that are very different and configured for a school setting. We've learned a lot from other jurisdictions that are also planning a safe reopening of their school. Many of the common features in our plan are shared by other jurisdictions that are developing plans to keep staff and students safe. And schools are different than, say, a shopping mall. These are secure, controlled sites. They're buildings that are distributed into different configurations with many rooms. We have a learning cohort model that is developed on the public health advice of Dr. Bonnie Henry and her team, and again is common with the features of many plans that you see in European countries and across Canada, and so we've worked as well during this planning period since we released the July 29th direction with local occupational health and safety teams, with local unions including teachers and support staff. And when we have orientation week on September 8th and 9th, the site-specific occupational health and safety teams will be able to orient every staff member about what safe practices look like and the different layers of protection. And then we will have that opportunity and the balance of the week to safely welcome back gradually students to have a similar COVID awareness orientation to their schools.
Graham, do you have a follow-up? Okay, moving on. Next question is from Marcella Bernardo, News 1130.
Hi, Minister. I was hoping to ask you, along with the lines of the last question, have you had a chance to actually visit any of these schools and see how they're being set up? Because I'm hearing from parents and teachers who say you cannot physically distance 20 kids in one classroom. So what concerns do you have after visiting schools, if you have, about properly spacing everybody out so they are staying 2 meters apart, or that they are in a situation where they're not going to be exposing someone else to this virus?
So again, we go back to the layers of protection that are critically important. The number one layer of protection is keeping levels of community transmission low in every part of British Columbia. The second is really around hand hygiene, enhanced cleaning, the public health principles around learning cohorts, so making sure that kids don't roam freely and interact with hundreds and hundreds of students in an elementary school, for example, but they stagger their break schedules and they keep to within a much smaller group of staff and fellow students. Self-monitoring for health each and every day, not going to school if you're sick, whether you're a staff member or a student, again, critically important. We have also worked with school districts around, making it possible to have frequent hand hygiene, for example, with additional hand washing stations, with having well-stocked supplies, with making masks not only available, but required in certain circumstances where students are traversing in an area where they can't keep physical distancing that's outside of their learning cohort. So those are the pillars of the plan that are quite common across jurisdictions. Physical distancing is promoted whenever possible. Certainly the public health principle in a school setting that must be adhered to, and I think kids even as young as kindergarten and grade 1 can understand, is to not have physical direct contact with one another. So kids will be a part of this as well, making this work. You play differently, you learn differently, you arrange the classroom in a way that conforms to the guidelines that we've developed. Those are some of the key principles of keeping our schools safe come September.
Marcella, do you have a follow-up?
Just, I guess, what backup plans or what safety protocols are in place should the numbers continue to spike to a point where we have to lock everything down again?
Look, I think we have the ability to, with our public health management, ensure that we have communities that are well managed, where there are episodes or outbreaks in workplace settings or in communities or from event gatherings. We've seen that with the Minister of Health announcing additional contact tracing resources. There are specific guidelines if and when a case should present itself in a school about exactly what you do in that situation, when a public health investigation begins. And also the plan that we have, the stages document, shows that if we get into a so-called second wave or a very different situation in the months or even into 2021, that we'll be able to move forward as well as we can move back. And I think the experience in June, where we did move forward into stage 3, was particularly valuable for British Columbia, which, other than Quebec, was alone in Canada for having a return to in-class instruction. The lessons we learned from that, I think, are ones that we can replicate if and when we should move backwards. But that will always be a call of public health officials working in consultation with the Ministry of Education and local school districts or a particular health region.
And it's from Shrishti Gangdev, CKNW.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm just wondering how subs and support teachers and staff who aren't necessarily tied to one school will play into learning groups and cohorts. So, for instance, if a teacher gets sick, how will a substitute teacher join that school for one day and then possibly go to another school the next day?
Yeah. So occupational health and safety committees have been working within districts around TTOC, substitute teacher guidelines. The number one strategy around a substitute teacher who might appear in front of a class for only one day is that they should maintain physical distancing. They don't technically become part of a learning group. For somebody on a longer assignment, they would become part of that student's learning group. I am aware that in consultation with local teachers associations in Vancouver School Board, They have created their own local guidelines around having quadrants of schools, so teachers would pick a limited number of schools where they would perform substitute teaching duties. So we expect to see similar local guidelines developed with their teachers' associations, but the guidelines that were issued by the PHO and the ministry do have very specific recommendations around how TTOCs have to be a little bit different in terms of how they interact with schools.
Do you have a follow-up, Shrishti?
Yeah, and so you said there are protocols if someone gets sick. Can you go into what those are?
Right. So if somebody is presenting symptoms, they would be isolated in a school. They would be only interacted by a limited number of people who are wearing a PPE. The individual suspected of having maybe COVID-like symptoms would wear a mask. They would go home immediately or as soon as possible to self-isolate and monitor themselves. And then if required, based on public health's involvement, there might be testing confirmations, there might be a series of steps. If it was determined to be a potential exposure event, that's when the investigation would take its course and determine where that individual was, who they might have been in close contact with, and all those sorts of things.
We have time for one more question, and that is from Georgie Smith, CBC.
Actually, it appears as though Georgie has dropped off the line.
Okay, moving on. Let's do John Hernandez, CBC.
Hey there, thank you for the question here. Just wondering, lastly, just a little bit more clarity on the possibility of the remote learning option. Is this something that will be mandatory for each district to provide? I'm thinking districts like Surrey or Vancouver. And then what would the message be to families in those districts that maybe don't get that option if these remote learning options aren't mandatory?
Right. So we do know that Vancouver and Surrey are out determining demand right now. They have active surveys that are school-based, looking at what the intentions today are for parents about returning their children to in-class instruction or something else. They have worked with their district administrators and teaching staff to look at other options. The thing they wanted from the province in terms of the conversation we've been having over the last number of weeks was funding confirmation and funding flexibility to be able to serve families with an education program if it is delivered a little bit differently. So I think you'll see many districts in Metro Vancouver, for example, pursuing similar courses of action that are happening right now. But again, it will look differently in different parts of the province because it always does. That's the great diversity of education in BC. We wouldn't seek to impose a solution on Arrow Lakes that wouldn't work for Vancouver nor vice versa. So what all districts I think are going to benefit from though is that they will have funding security and funding flexibility to be able to continue to serve communities. And as I mentioned, we have 30 districts right now working with First Nations communities and the broader community around remote learning options that they've indicated are things that they want to explore as an additional option come September.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, and then just quickly, what about students who are in programs of choice like French immersion? I guess what is the plan at the provincial level to make sure they don't lose their spots?
Yeah. So one of the things that districts stressed in many cases as a priority in configuring timetables and semesterly systems was to preserve the maximum amount of choice they could to keep kids engaged in the kind of learning pathway they decided for themselves in a secondary school situation, to keep on moving towards higher education or the kind of work that they want to do following school. I know that in terms of French immersion programs and its availability with regards to distributed learning, that's an area where the ministry is going to sit down with stakeholders to discuss exactly that in the coming days. But I know that districts in their plans, elementary, middle, and secondary schools, have done an incredible job preserving choice programs that are delivered in their local schools.
That's all the time we have this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.